A very fun aspect of video games, and I guess this applies to other media and entertainment as well, is that there is always entire new genres waiting for you to explore. More often than not, those experiences come in when you least expect them. In my case, I have never played games like Ace Combat before. I don't dislike it, but I never really thought of getting into them before. It's one of those cases where it simply flew under my radar, no pun intended. So you can imagine my surprise when among the games in one of the many cheap humble bundles I get, this little gem called Project Wingman popped up. I didn't think much of it being a humble bundle game. I thought it would be just a small arcade air combat game that I could play here and there for funsies. But what I ended up experiencing was quite the pleasant surprise, so let's get down to the basics. Project Wingman puts you under the wings of Monarch, a mercenary for hire working for the Hitman squad of the Sicario private military. Unlike most military heroes, your motivations are largely just money. You fight for the highest bidder, and whatever political or societal fallout comes from your battles is of no importance to you or your friends. Diplomat, a snarky yet smart pilot, and Comic, a female pilot that is just as snarky, and, along with Diplomat, they serve as the more proper protagonists since Monarch is silent. You and your friends, along with your PMC, are then hired by the rebel forces of Cascadia, as they are trying to fight for their independence from the Federation, a sort of union that has been taking territories all over the world, and true to any dictatorship, they claim to be supporting the people in there, while at the same time oppressing them violently. But there is more to the contract that meets the eye, as our three protagonists actually are natives of Cascadia. In a small quirk that I wish more games will utilize, the bulk of the narrative is told to us via the briefing screens every time you start a new mission, and the radio banter that happens during gameplay, which adds a lot of immersion since it shows you the war and the battle are advancing in real time as you're fighting your way through the game. Speaking of fighting, the gameplay takes a bit to get adjusted to, but once you get the hang of it, you start to notice how arcadey and simpler the controlling really is. Your plane is constantly moving forward, and the way you maneuver about it is largely with your mouse, while the rest of the controls on the keyboard let you pull crazy maneuvers while you're firing your weapons as well. And that's the easy part. The challenge proper begins with the battles themselves. True to the fantasy of military shooters, you are both one of the best pilots on your side of the conflict, but you are also just one more fighter in a bigger battlefield. Missions in this game can last up to 20 to 30 minutes as the battlefield is littered with enemies, and you do need to take down each and every one of them, including the ground targets. You have to eliminate the enemy one at a time, and it's not a walk in the park despite the simplicity of the controls. Enemies just like you can use flares. They can use the environment to their advantage, and while you are distracted with one enemy, other enemies can actually target you. So you have to strategize with how you pick apart your enemies, and you have to use your weapons wisely as you do not have infinite ammo. And running out means you're going to have to rely on your fellow pilots to take down the remaining enemies among the chaos. And AA partners are not exactly what I will rely on to 100% complete a level, even though they get their fair share of kills in every mission. Speaking of kills, the sheer chaos of every level is just beautiful. In the same level, you can go from dogfighting enemy planes, to bombing tanks, to destroying infrastructure, to then fighting behemoth airships that could easily shred you to bits. All of it while also dodging enemy fire, to then fighting among fellow elite pilots. What I really love about this is that as the levels progress and you continue to turn the tide of the battle with your actions, the radio chatter from the enemy starts to change too. First, you are seeing as just some guns for hire, random goons that the Federation can simply stamp out. But as you start reducing their numbers to ashes, they start to get startled, and then they start to get outright scared of you. And this actually resonates with you as a player, because all the crazy combat moves and defeating the odds that Monarch does are what you pull off as a player. Even if you get beaten up badly and you have to restart multiple times, coming out victorious is something that slowly but steadily turns the war in Cascadia's favor and establishes you and your friends as a legitimate threat to be feared. And this in turn plays directly into later twists and turns of the story, so it is a major case of gameplay and story integration that I appreciate, even if it is for a simpler middle market game like this one. But not all of it is this beautiful package of raining fire and brimstone onto your enemies. Again, I am ignorant to the genre, and I never played Ace Combat in my life. But this game has one negative, and that is that it has no checkpoints. Like, at all. I am counting this as a negative because of the sheer length of the levels. Again, you can be playing for up to 30 minutes, but if you get shot down or you accidentally faceplant into the ground or an enemy plane, you will have to start the level all over from the beginning. Now look, I don't claim to be the greatest player. I can live with failure. I have spent up to a week stuck on a boss in Dark Souls, and I know what it is like having to overcome a gameplay brick wall. But for the life of me, I cannot say I am a fan of the idea of a player's death setting you back for so long. I can take two guesses as to why they went with this design decision. One, because I'm guessing the Ace Combat games are just as unforgiving with their checkpoints, which seems to be the case judging by what I read in forums and social media. Two, they went with this route because it's kind of a hassle to program a checkpoint in a game where several dozen airplanes are scrambling all over the place, and setting a checkpoint means the game will have to remember exactly where each plane was and how the damage for each entity was so it can get reloaded. But regardless of what my guess is, the point is you can't afford to throw yourself into the battlefield and play it like a crazy madman. You have to be mindful of your environment and whatever is in front of you as you try to dodge enemy fire or you engage in the many dogfights with enemy planes. Which is pretty manageable. In my early hours of the game I will be constantly dying to the dumbest of mistakes and making myself angry, but once I learned to use the flares and to play smart with my fighting, it made the game a lot more fun and intense, and also very rewarding. This takes me into the in-game store. After all, you are a mercenary that is getting paid per contract and per kill. So the more kills you get in-game, the more money you are rewarded, and the more you can expand your arsenal by unlocking new planes with new weapon loaders to suit your needs. It's a small minor game store, but I find it to be a very effective one, as it is giving you a reason to customize your own experience and making some missions either easier or harder depending on which plane you're choosing to take with you, and some of these are really fantastic to play as. Which is good because for a game that is about air combat and dogfights, it has an insane amount of environments and combat scenarios. My personal favorites being when you are taking on an all-out sky battle with an enemy fleet, or an all-out naval warfare, going against enemy ships that even have freaking laser beams. Because just as the enemy begins to fear you anytime you show up in the front lines, they also start throwing everything they have at you. The lasers start to show up both on air and on land. Battleships become bigger and loaded with even more guns. And in the air, you start to face enemy mercenaries, and they also throw flying fortresses at you made of turrets and rocket launchers. And shooting down each and every one of them is just as satisfying as taking down other enemies one by one. It's all made sweeter with the story and the stakes going up, because along the narrative there is also character development. After all, you start the game as a ragtag company of misfits that is eventually making a territory-conquering superpowers lose what I can assume years worth of political and military progress. And I guess it's why I don't mind too much that Monarch is a silent protagonist. Comic and Diplomat do address your silence, and since the story slowly becomes a battle of ideals more than money, it could have been nice to hear exactly what Monarch has to say or what they think. But then again, there's not much need for dialogue when you let your guns and your missiles do the talk to the enemies that love to ramble on and on about why they are putting you to the grave. In general, Project Wingman is a surprisingly good game. It is fairly challenging, but once you get the hang of the controls and learn to pick an airplane you're more comfortable with, and with an arsenal that suits your needs, it becomes an adrenaline-pumping experience. It helps that you can get a more elaborate ending if you finish the game on higher difficulties, and you get to enjoy more open combat scenarios in the game's version of a roguelite-ish horde mode. So this makes for a pretty tasty gameplay package. This is why I am more than happy to give Project Wingman a very good and very well deserved 8 out of 10. It made for a pretty awesome introduction to the genre, and I always appreciate a game that encourages me to play smart rather than hard. It also makes me curious to one day take a look at the Ace Combat games or any other game in the genre, because right now, I can tell you with confidence, a whole new world opened up for me. I also appreciate how this game manages to do something that military shooters have failed to accomplish in the past 10 years. Even with a tale about a protagonist becoming infamous in the battlefield, by the end of the day, said protagonist is still one small part of a bigger conflict. It's always easy to make a story about saving the world, but sometimes a story with more self-contained stakes can make for a far more memorable experience.